Hi everyone, and welcome back to my IELTS Writing Task 1 Masterclass. This is lesson 3. If you haven't watched the previous two videos, I urge you to go back and review everything so that this lesson makes more sense to you. I've tried to make this course as approachable and easily accessible to everyone, regardless of their background, but I need you to work with me and to be patient and to watch these videos, because all the information that I present in these lectures might not be very significant at the time, but trust me, later in subsequent lectures, it will play a very important role. So let's see what we've covered so far and what we are going to cover in this third lesson in the Masterclass series. So in the previous two videos, we first became familiar with the task, what it wants from us, what we're supposed to do, and what the examiner is basically looking for. In the second lesson in the series, we reviewed the different kinds of charts that you may be presented with on the day of the test, and we also examined the different nature of the data contained in each. So if you recall, we reviewed line graphs, bar charts, pie charts, tables, flow charts, maps, and combination charts. And we saw that, in spite of all these surface level differences and variations, we essentially need to learn how to write a report for three types of data, those being quantitative, discrete, quantitative, interval, and qualitative process. In this lesson, we're going to focus on the steps that you need to take before you start writing your response. Unfortunately, many students who have sometimes even put hours and weeks into preparation leave the exam getting results that they were not expecting. So they were expecting higher results, but the grade didn't turn out to be what they expected. And a lot of the time, in my experience, the problem results from not preparing well before writing. Now you might say, well, we only have 20 minutes. What are we going to do? There is so much that could go wrong if you jump into this task prematurely without paying attention to the things that need to be noticed. In today's lesson, I'm going to describe a series of steps, sort of like instructions, procedural instructions, to make sure that A, we've understood these charts, that we're not misrepresenting the information, and 2, we need to decide how many paragraphs we're going to write, what we're going to include in the introduction, what we're going to put in the conclusion. Do we need a conclusion paragraph at all? So stick around until the end and you will be able to answer these very important questions for yourself. Let's begin with an example. So let's say we are on the test and this is the chart that we've been given. Now, we've previously seen this example. We have two pie charts. The question reads, the pie charts below show the popularity of different sports among male and female athletes in a small Australian town. We have two pie charts, and we're going to have to write a response of 150 to 200 words for this chart. Now, my first piece of advice is to make sure you have understood the information well. Now, you might say it's pretty obvious. Look, it's just two pie charts. What's the big deal? Trust me, a lot of students think this way, but when they leave the test, they suddenly realize, oh, I forgot to mention this aspect, or I forgot to pay attention to the scale. Numerous problems could arise. So what we're doing through these steps that I'm going to introduce to you, we're making sure that nothing has gone unnoticed. Let me show you how this works. So for understanding the data, the first thing that I want you to do, the first step, is to identify the MP. Now, what is the MP? MP stands for the noun phrase. And if you remember from the first lesson in this series, the question has a written component and then the visual component. In the written component, we have two parts. We have the description and the instructions. The description is the part that we're interested in right now. And the description, if you recall, follows the structure of subject, verb, MP. So the subject is usually the type of chart. So the line graph, right? That could be the subject. The pie charts in this example is the subject. Then we have a verb. This verb is usually something like shows, describes, indicates, depicts, illustrates, right? These are the types of verbs. Here, in this case, we have show. So these pie charts, or the pie charts below, show. Now, what do they show? This is very important. We need to see what the question is saying the data represents. So in this case, the noun phrase is the popularity of different sports among male and female athletes in a small Australian town. Now, we've identified the MP. It's the phrase beginning with the popularity of, all the way towards town. But what is the NP core? And by NP core, I mean a noun in the noun phrase that best represents what these numbers are representing. I'll tell you what I mean. Look, in this pie chart, the one on the left representing male athletes, as it says here, we have 26%. Okay, 26% of what? Is it 26% of basketball players who were male? Or is it 26% of athletes play basketball? What am I missing in each of these cases? Now you see, in both of my examples, something went wrong. And we'll later see what went wrong. But the sentences that I just shared with you don't accurately represent what these pie charts are showing. But if we look closely at the MP, and we realize that it's basically the percentage of male and female athletes. So the MP core in this case is athletes. Now you might be wondering, okay, fine, but how is this important? Well, it's important because later when we are writing our report, we know that whenever we say 26%, we are referring to 26% of male or female athletes. If you misidentify this MP core, chances are you might write a report which you think represents what this data is showing, but in fact, it's showing something else. I'll show you what I mean with a few more examples. But for now, suffice it to say that after looking at the subject, verb, and MP, we've identified the word athletes as the core of this MP. Okay, step 2. What you need to do is I want you to notice the features of the chart. There are certain features of charts that we need to very consciously pay attention to and look at the information surrounding them. These are, quite specifically, the axes. So, for example, if you have a line graph, I want you to look at the vertical axis, and then I want you to look at the horizontal axis and ask yourself, what is being shown in this vertical axis? What is being demonstrated through the horizontal axis? So I want you to be conscious of what these axes are showing. If you have a table, you don't have axes anymore. So instead, I want you to focus on the columns and the rows. What are the columns showing? What are the rows representing? And so knowing what is shown in each case can really help you better understand the data. Another feature that I want you to look at is the scale. So a lot of the time we have numbers, right? So we have 2, 4, 6, 8. But it's not 2, 4, 6, 8 students. It's actually 2,000, 4,000, 6,000, and 8,000 students. And just because we didn't pay attention to the information surrounding the scale, we may have come up with numbers that aren't accurate. So if I write a report, and in my report I keep talking about how 2 students increased to 4 students, whereas it was actually 2,000 students increasing to 4,000 students, this is a very critical error on my part, and it's going to cost me dearly. So just by paying a few seconds of attention to these features, you can ensure that you're not making mistakes such as the one that I just described. Another aspect, another feature of the report that I want you to pay attention to is what we call the key. So the key basically means any written information that can help us better understand the chart. So for example, if you've seen old maps, you'll notice there's a legend accompanying the map. Also, those of you who work with charts and graphs know that the term legend is used for any piece of information that will help us understand or interpret the information in the chart. So for example, sometimes you have a little key that says the color black represents, for instance, international students, and the color white represents domestic students, right? So these two colors that we have are shown it's clear what is being displayed and what is being represented by these two colors. So far we've looked at the axes, which is something you need to identify in the case of line graphs and bar charts. We've looked at columns and rows, which is something that you need to be mindful of when you're dealing with a table. We have looked at scales, which could really appear in any kind of chart, really. And we've also looked at the key, which is any type of descriptive guide information that the chart has provided to us. And if you're dealing with a pie chart, such as in this example, I just want you to read any information. So for example, here we have percentage of male athletes. You can consider that as a key, or the percentage of female athletes. Again, it's helping us distinguish these two pie charts from one another. Or we have the names of the sports that they are engaged in, right? So this is as far as we go. When it comes to flow charts and maps, that is qualitative data, we don't really have axes, columns, rows, scales, and a key. So instead, what I want you to do is describe what you see in your head. And this is going to help you determine whether you've understood everything. Now you might say, well, why can't I just figure it out as I'm writing? Well, that's because when you are writing, sometimes you've written like half of a paragraph and then you suddenly realize, or it dawns on you, that a certain aspect of your response is wrong. Now what? Are you going to go back and delete what you've written and rewrite it? Well, that's a waste of time. You could have, averted this situation by paying attention to all these features in advance. So my advice to you is to, if it's a qualitative chart, just describe the process in your head. Make sure you have it all figured out. If it's a quantitative chart, then I want you to pay attention to the axis, the columns and rows, the scale, and the key, as I mentioned. Now, step 3 is a really interesting step because it's like a litmus test. If you can successfully pass step 3, it means that you have this, you got this, you know what you're doing. And here's what I want you to do in step 3. I want you to randomly pinpoint a section of the chart and describe it in simple words. This is very important. You can even do it in your own language, because at this point, we're not interested in the language, grammar, vocabulary aspect of the writing process. We're mostly interested in have you understood the chart? And it really doesn't matter if you've understood the chart in English or in your own language. Understanding that level of thinking, abstraction that we have in thinking, it doesn't really relate to any language. So if you've understood it, it doesn't matter if you've stated this sentence in your own language or in English. Let me show you what I mean. So first of all, try to be random, because if you choose a section that you think is easy to describe, then you're not really challenging yourself and you're not really helping with this step of the process. The real challenge is in suddenly, randomly choosing a given section of the chart and then being able to describe that section of the chart in simple words. I'll show you what I mean. So let's say we want to go with this part of the chart. I've randomly pinpointed a chart, and this is the part that I'm going to be describing. So I have basketball, 26%, and this is related to male athletes. Now, I've previously identified the MP, so I know it's 20% of male athletes. And I've also looked at the key, the information around the chart. So I think I know what I'm doing. So let's see. How can we state a sentence in our own words that best demonstrates my understanding of this chart? Okay, I'm going to give you two options, and I'm going to show you how they are different. The first one is, we'll put it this way. We'll say, for example, male athletes formed 26% of basketball players in Australia. Okay, so this is option one, me describing this part of the pie chart in my own words. In the second instance, I'm going to put it a little bit differently. I'm going to say 26% of male athletes in Australia played basketball. Now, we have two options here. And on the surface, you might say, well, they're both right. But no, think about it. They're saying different things. The first sentence says, of all the basketball players in Australia, 26% were male. Is that what it is? Do we have, a total sum of all athletes and 26% of them, being male basketball players? No, something is wrong. And this is because if a student were to write a sentence like this, it clearly demonstrates that they haven't understood the chart correctly. Maybe they did part of this process wrong, these 3 steps. Maybe they made a mistake, or maybe they forgot to follow these steps, and that's why they came up with a sentence. But regardless of which it is, this sentence is incorrect. On the other hand, when I say 26% of male athletes in Australia played basketball, this is closer to what the examiner wants and what the data is showing. Because if you think about it, the 26% relates to the NP, in this case, the male athletes, right? So from among the male athletes, 26% played basketball. Now, this example clearly shows how by not following the instructions provided and not paying attention to these details, you may end up writing a paragraph or an entire report that is grammatically correct. It includes, great words. Maybe there's a lot of coherence and cohesion. So everything's great, except for the fact that you have completely misrepresented the data. So please don't take this step lightly. Don't say, oh, I'm just going to do it in my head. Ideally, write this random sentence, and it's really going to help you, guarantee that you're not making any major mistakes. Okay, now we've followed these 3 steps to understand the data. Now it's time for us to plan the report. And it doesn't matter what kind of chart you're given. You always need to answer 3 questions to determine what needs to be figured out in advance. So number 1, that is the first question that you need to answer. Question number 1, or the first question that you need to answer, is how can I divide the data into 2 or 3 parts? Okay, this is question number 1. You always need to look at your data and ask yourself, how can I logically divide this information into 2 or 3 parts? Now, you might be wondering, why 2 or 3? Like, what's the big deal here? Why do I need to write either 2 or 3? Why do I need to come up with 2 or 3 parts? And the answer is simple. These will form your body paragraphs. So if you can logically divide the data into 2 parts, then you're going to have 2 body paragraphs. If you divide the information into 3 parts, then you're going to have 3 body paragraphs. But remember, there should be a very clear logic behind your paragraphs. You can't just say, oh, well, I'll just write 3 sentences in the first paragraph, and then I'll move to the second one and I'll write 3 more. No, that's not how it works. When I am reading your response, or when the examiner is reading your response, we should immediately know what the rationale is, what the logic is for breaking these paragraphs. Is it just random, or do you have a clear logic? Now, the logic doesn't have to be very complicated. It can be very simple logic. For example, in this pie chart that you see here, we have percentage of male athletes and percentage of female athletes. So it makes sense for us to have 2 body paragraphs. Why is that? Well, because we're going to write 1 paragraph for male athletes and 1 for female athletes. It's very clear. In fact, it's so clear that it's really hard to do it any other way. The easiest, most straightforward approach to this is to write 2 paragraphs, right? And this kind of helps answer a very important question. And that is, when you're dealing with combination charts, when you're dealing with 2 pie charts or a line graph and a table and maybe a pie chart, you basically write 1 paragraph for each of these kinds of charts, right? So if you have 2 pie charts, you have 2 body paragraphs. If you have a line graph and a table, again, you're probably going to have 2 paragraphs, 1 for the table and 1 for the pie chart, or whatever that second chart happens to be. Okay, so that's question number 1. Following this question, the second question you'll need to ask yourself is, how can I summarize each part into 2 to 3 sentences? If you remember, in IELTS Task 1, one of the expectations of the task is for you to write a response that is between 150 to 200 words and also summarizes the information. Now, if I describe everything I see in these 2 pie charts, how many sentences will I end up writing? Well, I know I have 2 paragraphs. In the first paragraph, if I write 1 sentence for basketball, 1 for swimming, 1 for track and field, 1 for cycling, 1 for chess, and 1 for table tennis, I will have written 6 sentences. And I'll probably have to do the same, right? Because I can't write 6 sentences describing the percentage of male athletes, but only 2 sentences for females. That way, I will not have balance across my paragraphs. So I need to have the same number of sentences in my paragraphs. Now, on average, this isn't a hard rule, but on average, you will achieve 150 to 200 words by having 2 or 3 paragraphs, which are each 2 or 3 sentences long. And so in some cases, you will need to only select 3 pieces of information to include. And in other cases, you will need to compress the information and include more information in only 2 or 3 sentences. But regardless of which approach you adopt, remember, each of your paragraphs should ideally be 2 or 3 sentences. If it gets any longer than that, then you run the risk of writing a response that is too long, perhaps exceeding 200 words, or writing a response that falls short of the 150 word requirement. In this case, let's try to consider how we would write a response. I have 6 sports, right? So 6 sports for male athletes and 6 sports for female athletes. So if I can't mention everything, how about I focus on the highest percentage? So for example, for male athletes, the highest percentage belong to cycling, right? So highest, the most, the number 1 ranking, variable, that's always important. You want to include that. So one sentence can be the highest. Another sentence can be focused on the smallest percentage. So look, chess, for example, isn't a game that's of a lot of interest to male students. In fact, the smallest percentage of male athletes chose to play chess. So as you can see, whenever we're trying to summarize the information, our aim is to focus on highest, lowest, right? So ranks, things that rank number 1 or rank number 10, highest and lowest. So in this case, we have 2 sentences figured out. What about the rest? Am I going to ignore the rest? Well, here's the deal. What you could emphasize in addition to the highest and lowest amount is anything that is either a set proportion. So for example, you could say basketball forms almost a quarter or approximately a quarter of male athletes, or attracts a quarter of the male athletes. As you can see, I'm focusing on a proportion, a percentage, a fraction that is worthy of reporting. Or for example, that swimming constitutes only 10%, right? Or something along those lines. You could focus on similarities as well. You could say among male athletes, track and field and swimming seem to devote the same percentage of male athletes to themselves. Now, the question that remains is, should I mention everything? Well, you need to ask yourself this question. Can I mention everything in 2 or 3 sentences? In this case, I believe I can, because it's manageable to report 6 numbers in 3 sentences. But if you're dealing with, let's say, a table that has 3 columns and, let's say, 10 rows, then how are you going to summarize 10 numbers in 3 sentences? I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's difficult and you'll need to really carefully think about it. In this case, here's how I would do it. I would write one sentence that focuses on the highest percentage and the second highest percentage. That is, cycling and basketball formed the number 1 and number 2 sports among male athletes. And I'm going to mention the numbers, right? So 34% followed by basketball, which was 26%. Note that I've only written one sentence so far, right? But this one sentence represents 2 numbers, basketball and cycling, cycling and basketball, which happen to be the first and the second ranking sports among male athletes. Okay, what about my second sentence? Well, in my second sentence, I could perhaps mention how chess is the least common sport among male athletes, right? So I could mention that here. And then what remains is 3. I have table tennis, swimming, and track and field. Can I mention all 3 numbers in a third sentence? Probably. I could say, while swimming and track and field attract the same percentage of male athletes, table tennis accounts for 17% of male athletes in Australia. As you can see, I managed to explain everything and cover all of these numbers that you could see in the chart in only 3 sentences. Now, you could try to do the same for female athletes. See if you can possibly summarize all the information in 2 or 3 sentences. If you can't, you may have to ignore some of the information. So once again, just to make it a little bit more clear, let's imagine instead of 5 or 6 sports, we had 15 sports in each of these pie charts. Now, granted, the pie chart is going to look very confusing. It's going to have lots of colors and figures in it. But for the sake of argument, let's say we have 15 categories in a pie chart. If we have 15 categories, there is no way I'm going to be able to mention 15 sports and how they're ranked along with their numbers in only 3 sentences, in 2 to 3 sentences. So what am I going to do instead? Easy. I'm just going to report the highest, the lowest, those that are similar or close in percentage or number, and also any notable fractions or percentages that could be mentioned. Finally, the third question that I need you to answer is regarding the main points. If you recall, in the description section, we always had subject noun MP, the subject verb MP. In the instruction section, we were always told to summarize the information, right? By selecting and reporting the main features, which is sort of what we've done, right? We summarize the information only by selecting the highest, the lowest, the similarities, right? The main features, and then make comparisons where relevant. Remember, this was also part of the task. Make comparisons where relevant. There are so many comparisons that I could make in these 2 pie charts. I could compare male basketball players to female basketball players. I could compare male basketball players to male cyclists. Or I could compare table tennis among female athletes to table tennis among male athletes, or table tennis athletes compared to track and field female athletes. So many dimensions of comparison. And there's really no way I can include every single comparison, because you just do the basic math. You're going to have a lot of possible comparisons to make. So if I can't draw all those comparisons, then I'll probably need to limit myself to 1 or 2 comparisons that are very meaningful, that help us understand what's generally going on among male and female athletes in Australia, right? So you want to draw a comparison that could serve as a key point. And we're going to call these important comparisons key points, or sometimes I refer to them as vital information. Vital information is the essential information that must always come out of a good response. So the third question is, how can I identify 2 pieces of vital information in the chart? Okay, so we need to find 2 pieces of vital information. Let's take a look at this pie chart right now, and let's see what kind of comparison would make sense. Well, if we look at the highest percentages, we'll see that among females, it seems that basketball is number 1, right? So we have 27%, all other numbers fall below. Among male athletes, it seems that cycling is number 1, and basketball is number 2, right? And look, what other similarities do you see? Well, I can see that swimming is identical. We have 10% of male athletes showing an interest in swimming, and also 10% of female athletes showing a proclivity towards this sport. So what do we see? What are the points of departure? That is stark contrasts that you can see in these pie charts. And what are the points of similarity? For me, the 10% swimming, which is equal among male and female athletes, stands out. This can serve as one meaningful comparison. Another meaningful comparison for me is that in both cases, both male and female athletes, around 1/4. Now, you see, the numbers aren't absolute. It's approximate, right? Approximately a quarter of male and female athletes were attracted to basketball. So you can see, I'm focusing on the similarities. Always draw a comparison and find meaningful similarities. But similarities aren't the only feature that you could include in your response. Sometimes it's stark contrast. For example, the biggest difference among male and female athletes seems to be in their interest in chess. So while 21% of female athletes enjoyed chess or played chess, only 2% of male athletes were interested in this sport. So as you can see, when it comes to identifying this vital piece of information, if you have a combination chart, like these two pie charts that you can see here, I want you to compare the two and see what kind of meaningful similarities or meaningful distinctions you can find. And these will be presented as key features of our report. Okay, now, by answering these questions, 1, I've guaranteed that I've understood the chart, and number 2, I am certain that I know how many paragraphs I'm going to write. I know I will be writing 2 paragraphs. I know how many sentences I'll be including in each of my paragraphs. In this case, remember, I have 3 sentences for male athletes, where I represent all 6 numbers actually, and I'm going to include 3 sentences for female athletes representing everything. And the key points that I will be putting on the forefront and really bringing to the examiner's attention, just to show the examiner that I've found this information, is any kind of meaningful similarity or any stark contrast that I can see between these charts. Okay, now that we've kind of got the hang of this, let's try to apply the same questions to another task. But this time, look, we have a map, really, a process qualitative chart. We've read this task before, but I'll read the prompt one more time. It says the maps below show the map of Woodbridge Shopping Center in 1984 and 2002. So, am I going to identify the noun phrase and do all that? No, because this is a qualitative chart and the rules are a little different in qualitative charts. What you need to do is kind of follow the changes that you see in these 2 maps, starting from one corner and working your way to the other end. I'll tell you what I mean. So starting from the south, the southwestern corner, if we look at the 4 directions, the southwestern corner, we can see that there used to be a road from the western end leading up to the entrance, but now a parking lot has been built in its place. Then we have the entrance remains in the same location. There used to be a lake. This lake has now been removed, and the size of the shopping center has been expanded. As you can see, what I'm doing, and I'm not going to read this on and go over all the observed differences, but as you can see, what I'm doing is I'm very quickly, with my eyes, just going over, taking note of all of the changes I've observed, to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks or that I don't forget to mention any of these details when it comes to writing the report. So as you can see, the process of understanding is a little, I would say, even easier, right? Because if you're doing it in your own language, it's not very complicated. And all you have to do is, again, take a mental note of all of the observable differences. The next step, remember, was understanding. And the three questions were, how can I divide this information or this chart into 2 or 3 parts? Now, the first mistake that a lot of students make is they look at this and they say, well, I'm going to write 2 paragraphs. I'm going to write 1 paragraph from 1984, and I'm going to write 1 paragraph for 2002. That does it, right? No, because you see, in qualitative data, you're supposed to describe the process of change, not to describe what it was like, just purely descriptive, in 1984, and then what it looked like in 2002. It's about describing the changes across time. The process needs to be described, right? So you can't say, oh, in the past, in 1984, there used to be a lake, there was a coffee shop, a food store. You can't just devote a whole paragraph to describing what the shopping mall looked like in 1984 without representing the changes that have occurred over time. Do you see? Therefore, what you need to do is take note of all the changes. Let's say we've made a list of 10 changes that have occurred. The lake was removed, the shopping center was expanded, a parking lot was built, the water fountain remained the same, an electronics store opened. So as you can see, there's a theme restaurant. We make a list of all the changes. We have 10. What are we going to do? Easy. We put 5 of them in the first paragraph, and we put the other 5 in the second paragraph. So yes, we will end up writing 2 paragraphs, but our 2 paragraphs will not correspond to the before and the after, but rather they will divide up all the changes observed into 2 or 3 parts, usually 2, and presented in 2 or 3 separate paragraphs, right? Okay, and then summarizing it. Summarizing a flowchart or a map, qualitative data, isn't really that difficult. It's not that complicated. In fact, many students have a problem reaching the word count when it comes to qualitative reports, and they struggle with reaching the 150 word count. Very rarely do we have instances where it's hard to mention everything in less than 200 words. But remember, you need to adjust the level of detail you include. So, for example, if you think there are a lot of changes, then you might want to bundle them together into fewer sentences. But when there are fewer changes that are observable in the maps, then you want to focus on describing those changes with as much detail as possible in order to help you reach the word count. Okay, so far we've looked at one example of a quantitative report, which is the double pie charts, the combination pie charts that we just saw. And we also looked at one example of a qualitative chart, which is the map that you see here. And we've tried to go over the steps of preparation. Let's do another example here to help us better understand. This time, we're dealing with a line graph, and we want to see how we're going to answer the planning questions and also how we can understand the chart. I'm going to walk you through it. So basically what I'm doing is I'm thinking out loud, and this is what should be going through your head as you read the question and decide on the important stuff in preparation for your response. So I'm going to read the task one more time, even though we've read it before. The line graph below shows the number of students enrolled in 4 academic fields at Northview University between 1965 and 2005. The second part is redundant. It's the same thing we've seen time and time again. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. But we knew all that. Okay, so first things first, what is the MP core? Remember, step 1 in understanding is identifying the MP core. The line graph below, that's the subject, shows, that's the verb, the number of students enrolled in 4 academic fields at Northview University between 1965 and 2005. Okay, what is the MP core? Is it academic fields? Like 10 academic fields reduced to 12, increased to 12 academic fields. Does that make sense? I don't think so. Students, it's about the number of students, right? So when we say 12,000, it's not 12,000 academic fields, it's 12,000 students. So we've identified the MP core. Now, remember, step 2, look at the chart and identify its features. Okay, I know we have a vertical axis here, which shows the number of students, the same MP core that we identified here in the question. And we have a scale of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12, right? But the key here shows me that this is in the thousands. So it's 2,000, 4,000, 6,000, 8,000, 10,000, 12,000. Remember, when I said pay attention to the key, this is what I mean. If you had failed to pay attention to this, you might have ended up writing a report that describes everything quite perfectly, except for the fact that the numbers are in the thousands. And you may have forgotten this, and this is going to affect your score. So pay a little extra attention before you jump into the task. The horizontal axis is the next part I'm going to be looking at. And as you can see, we have years. And the scale is 10 years, right? So we have 1965 to 75 to 85 to 95 to 2005. So we have a scale of 10 years. It says number of students registered at Northview University. A lot of the time, this MP that you get in the question will be repeated here above the task itself, which is what we can see here. And the MP core is students once again. And again, looking at the key, we have here the name of our 4 variables. So we have the changes in the number of students enrolled in the hard sciences, in engineering majors, in medicine, and also in arts and humanities. So 4 variables corresponding to 4 lines, each representing a different set of majors. Now, remember, the next step would be to make a sentence. Remember, randomly select a given part of the chart and describe it in simple words. I'm going to take this part of the chart. Okay, this part from 1965 to 1975 from this variable. Okay, how am I going to do that? I'll show you. It says hard science, so I know this is related to. It says engineering, so I know this is related to engineering. And okay, so engineering, but what about engineering? Well, I know this is the number of students, so perhaps I can say the number of students who were enrolled in engineering majors. That's accurate, right? Okay, what happened to the number of students who were enrolled in engineering majors? Well, it increased from 1965 to 1975. How much did it increase? It increased from over 8,000 to over 10,000 students. Okay, let me see if I can put all of this together in a sentence. I can say the number of students enrolled in the engineering majors at Northview University increased from 1965 to 1975 from over 8,000 to just above 10,000 students. There. So you see, I stated this sentence and I tried to include as many details as possible. So did I need to mention Northview University? No, not really, because it's all in Northview University, right? So you don't necessarily need to include every contextual detail when you're stating this sentence. But this sentence makes me feel confident that I've understood the data correctly and that I'm ready to write my response. But not so fast. Remember, planning. Planning involves answering 3 questions. Number 1, how can I divide this information into 2 or 3 parts? Well, how many variables do I have? I have 4. I have hard sciences, engineering, medicine, arts, and humanities. How can I divide this information into 2 or 3 parts. I have 4 variables, so I can't write one paragraph for each variable, because if I do that, I'll end up with 4 paragraphs, and I can't. Remember? Because it'll probably result in a very lengthy response. So what can I do? I can bundle or group these variables together, ideally based on some kind of rationale. For example, I can see in this line graph that the number of students enrolled in hard sciences and in engineering majors has fallen from 1965 to 2005. On the other hand, the number of students enrolled in medicine and also in arts and humanities has increased. So one way I can solve this problem is by writing one paragraph for hard science and engineering and writing a separate paragraph for medicine, arts, and humanities. Remember, this is only one possible way of solving the problem. You could come up with another reasoning or method of classification. Let's say instead of number of students enrolled in these majors, we had the amount of chicken, lamb, beef, and fish that is consumed in a country. So our 4 variables are lamb, beef, chicken, and fish. So what I could do is I could have red meat versus white meat, right? So I could have lamb and beef described in one paragraph, and then chicken and fish described in another paragraph. Note that in this case, we're not looking at whether, which ones are rising, which ones are falling. We're looking at the nature of the variables to make this decision. So you need to familiarize yourself with different examples. And in each case, you need to ask yourself, how would I logically make this division? The next question is, okay, so let's say you're writing one paragraph for hard science and engineering and one paragraph for medicine and humanities. You can only afford to include 2 or 3 sentences for each of those paragraphs. In other words, I should be able to summarize everything you see here regarding hard science and engineering in 2 to 3 sentences. How am I going to do that? I'll show you. I could write one sentence for hard science where I say the number of students enrolled in the hard sciences decreased from over 10 to above 8,000 students, right? That's one sentence and it describes everything. But for engineering students, maybe I can do 2 sentences. I could say, for engineering students, although there was an initial rise from above 8 to just over 10,000 students, it subsequently declined sharply until 1985, reaching between 6,000 and 8,000 students, and finally dropping to below 6,000 students in 2005. Notice that it's a very long sentence, but it's still one sentence. And so altogether, I managed to put together one paragraph consisting of 3 sentences describing the hard science and engineering majors. Now, think about how you would do the same thing for medicine, arts, and humanities. If you're going to write one paragraph describing both students enrolled in medicine and those enrolled in arts and humanities, how would you summarize it in only 2 to 3 sentences? A few tips. Whenever you're dealing with interval data, like what you can see here, focus on the starting point. Focus on what happens in the end. What is the general trend? If the general trend can be summed up in 1 or 2 sentences, it's always more important than all the minor details that you may see here and there. So starting points, end points can be important to report. Another thing you should focus on is the peak and the low point. So for example, when you're describing engineering students, it might be worthy to mention how the highest number of students enrolled in engineering took place in the year 1975, with over 10,000 students enrolled in this major. As you can see, peaks and low points are important, and if you can, try to mention them in your report. Other than that, focus on the general trends, focus on what has happened to this variable over time, removing as many unnecessary details as possible. Okay, now we figured out our paragraphs. We know we're going to write 2 paragraphs, and we know how many sentences we're going to include in each. The final question that remains is vital information, key points, remember? And you need to find 2 key points. What key points can we find here? Well, number 1, for your first key point, try to come up with a general overview of what has happened to these variables. What do I mean? I'll show you. If you look at the general trends here and you ignore any, increases or decreases that happened in between, you'll notice that we have a declining trend for hard science and engineering majors, and we have an increasing trend for medicine, arts, and humanities. So this itself can serve as a key point for your response. Your first key point can be, although there has been a decline in the number of students enrolled in hard sciences and engineering, the number of students who have chosen medicine or arts and humanities has increased over the years. As you can see, without mentioning any numbers, without mentioning any details, I'm only reporting the general observable trend, with 2 variables declining over time and 2 variables increasing over time. Notice that any change that runs contrary to that general trend is ignored. What do I mean by this? For example, in the engineering major, we have an initial rise and then a decline. But I'm not going to mention that initial rise because my focus is on the general trend. And the general trend is that overall, the number of engineering students fell in spite of those increases that happened in the middle, right? So that can be the first key point. So whenever you're dealing with interval data, try to come up with a key point that sums up the overall trend. Which ones are rising, which ones are falling, and which ones have perhaps remained the same. The next question that I want you to ask yourself as you're trying to come up with another key point is draw a comparison. Do a very quick comparison and see if there is something that is always true. I'll tell you what I mean. For example, if you look at this chart, you'll notice that the number of students enrolled in the hard sciences was always ranking first, right? At no point in this chart, in spite of the decline that is, at no point in this chart do we have students from engineering, medicine, or arts and humanities exceeding or becoming greater in number compared to hard sciences. So hard sciences is always number 1. That's important. That's a significant piece of information. They always ranked first. The same, but opposite, can be said about arts and humanities. From 1965 to 2005, every year, the number of arts and humanities students was lowest compared to the other ones. So as you can see, we have one variable that is constantly the highest and one variable that is constantly the lowest. So for your second key point, I want you to compare the variables and see if there is a meaningful difference or a meaningful similarity perhaps. I'll give you another example. Let's say we have a line graph with 4 variables of chicken, fish, beef, and lamb, right? And as we look closely at the general trends, we see that there is an increase in white meat consumption and a decrease in red meat consumption. right? That's what we've observed. People are consuming more white meat and they're consuming less and less red meat over time. But when I look closely, I see that at the beginning of the period, beef was the most consumed type of meat. And by the end, chicken, which was third to begin with, outgrew beef in consumption. What does that mean? It means one of my key points can be stated as follows. Although at the beginning of the time period, people consumed more beef than chicken, by the end of the reported period, chicken consumption had outgrown the amount of beef consumption. So while, beef consumption was greater than chicken consumption at the beginning, by the end, the people consumed more chicken than beef. So as you can see, it's a reversal. And seeing that reversal over time can be a very good key point worthy of mentioning in your report. So there, we just answered the same set of questions, this time for an interval chart. Now we're going to do one last example before we go, because we've looked at a combination chart, we've looked at one example of a qualitative chart, that is a map that we reviewed together, and now we're going to look at a discrete chart. We looked at an interval chart, and now we're going to look at a discrete chart. Let me read the question for you very quickly, just to give you a general understanding, and then we'll delve into the details. It says, the bar chart below shows the percentage of people owning different types of vehicles by fuel type in a European country. The second part, as always, is quite redundant. It's something we've seen before. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Okay, so remember step one, understanding. I'm going to walk you through this very quickly, okay? I'm going to be a little bit more, quick in going over what you need to pay attention to, because we've done this before. So remember, understanding. Step one, look at the question, identify the MP. The bar chart below is the subject, shows is the verb, the percentage of people owning different types of vehicles by fuel type in a European country. European country? No, I don't think we can say 30% of European country. Fuel type? 30% of diesel fuel cars? No, that's not it. Different percentages of people. So these correspond to the percentage of people who own these types of charts. So people is the MP core. Step two, look at the features. The vertical axis shows the percentage of people. Remember, so people was the MP. The vertical axis shows the percentage of people. The horizontal axis, what does it show? Remember from a few lessons ago, the horizontal axis usually shows the different categories of the data. In this case, we have 6 categories of cars, vans, hatchbacks, sedans, SUVs, minivans, and trucks. And then we also have a distinction of these types of cars by fuel type. So we have electric, gas, and diesel, right? For each category. Okay, so we've identified what is represented by the vertical axis, the horizontal axis, the scale. So it's 5, 10, 15, 20. So it's increasing by 5 percentage points each case. And what about key? Well, it says percentage of vehicle ownership by fuel source and vehicle type 1. So yeah, that's also a repetition of what was in the question. I don't think there's anything else. I've checked out everything. Okay, now it's time for me to pick a random part of this chart and describe it in simple terms. I'm going to go with this bar here. You can see it here. So it's hatchback, 20%, and gas. Okay, so hatchback, 20%, and gas. Let's see if we can put this all together. So it's 20% of what? We know it's 20% of people, right? So we could say 20% of people in this European country okay, owned hatchbacks that were gas-fueled. Is this correct? 20% of all people? No, that's not true. It's actually something else. It's 20% of people who owned hatchbacks drove gas-fueled vehicles. You see, it's 20% of owners in the hatchback category who owned gas-fueled vehicles. This is important. If you miss any part of this, or you state it in a different way, chances are you're misrepresenting the data, or that you've misunderstood the data entirely. Okay, so these 3 steps, they summarize the first phase, which is understanding. The second phase is planning. Remember? 3 questions. Number 1, how can I divide the information into 2 or 3 parts? Okay, the division's already done for us, right? Remember, the task itself has divided these cars based on the car type and also the fuel type. But we don't want that. We want our own categorization maybe. Or perhaps we're going to look for whichever type of division will yield 2 or 3 paragraphs. Now, if I divide up my paragraphs based on the car type, I will have 6 paragraphs. 1 for vans, 1 for hatchbacks, 1 for sedans, 1 for SUVs, 1 for minivans, and 1 for trucks. I cannot afford to write 6 paragraphs. Remember, 2 or 3. Okay, what other option do I have? Well, what if I go with the other classification? That is, what if I write 3 paragraphs? 1 for electric, 1 for gas, and 1 for diesel vehicles, right? Diesel fueled vehicles. This one works beautifully. So if you have in a bar chart a type of classification which will automatically result in 2 or 3 parts, that's always your best bet. But what if we had like 5 types of cars, as you can see here, and we had like 5 sources of energy? I don't know what those other sources of energy would be, but let's say for the sake of argument. What am I going to do now? Well, now I have to go with one of these types of division and then bundle or group them together. For example, if I decide to go with the car types, maybe I can put vans, minivans, trucks together, and then put hatchback, sedan, and SUV together. And the rationale would be, household versus, cars that one would own as for example, as a business, right? So that's my rationale. Or if I have 5 fuel types, maybe I could divide them based on whether they are fossil fuels or they are alternative fuels, right? So I could divide up the data into 2 parts based on the type of fuel, not by individual category, but bundling them into, let's say, alternative versus, fossil fuel sources of energy. And so with that, I have decided how many paragraphs I'm going to write. In this case, 3 paragraphs. Remember, electric, gas, diesel, that's pretty straightforward. Now, the next question is, how can I summarize each of these into 2 or 3 sentences? If I'm not summarizing, like let's say I'm writing a report that will describe everything here. How many sentences am I going to write for electric? Well, I have electric vans, electric hatchbacks, electric sedans, electric SUVs, electric minivans, and electric trucks. I cannot write 6 sentences. So what am I going to do instead? Well, in the electric category, I'm only going to mention the highest and the lowest percentage, right? So I can say the highest percentage of electric cars owned were in the sedan category, right? And the smallest percentage of electric vehicles belonged to the van category. Do you see what I just did there? I didn't mention all of the categories and their numbers. For each category, I focused on the highest, the lowest, perhaps the ones that are similar, or anything that has a significant proportion maybe attached to it, right? Like a quarter of, or a fifth of, or something like that. Okay, now we can do the same for gas and also for diesel. And so we have 3 paragraphs, each one made up of 2 or 3 sentences. Which brings me to the final question we need to answer, and that is, how can I find 2 pieces of vital information, or what are 2 key points that I can present in the overview of my response? I'll show you. First of all, look for recurring patterns. Something that you could say and begin your sentence with always. Like always something is the highest, or always something is the lowest, or always X is greater than Y. Let's see if we can find something like this. Well, in the hatchback category, gas-fueled powers are number 1. Sedan, gas-fueled powers cars are number 1. But it's not true about minivans. It's not true about trucks. It's not true about vans. So, as you can see, it's not something that spans across all of the categories. And I'm actually looking for something that would hold true for all instances. Okay? So what can I find? Well, maybe if I just compare 2 of the categories, I'll find something meaningful. For example, what if I compare electric vehicles to diesel? Okay? It seems that in vans, hatchbacks, right? So we're again comparing electric and diesel. So we're comparing this bar and this bar, this bar and this bar, right? And so as you can see, electric is greater than diesel in among van owners. Electric is greater than diesel among hatchback owners, among sedan owners as well, but not among SUVs, minivans, but also true among trucks. So you can see we have an exception. If you look at all these different categories and you really can't find something that's always true, then you could mention the rule plus the any possible exception to the rule. So for example, I could say something like, it seems that in most car categories, the percentage of electric vehicles exceeds those that are diesel fueled. Except for, so you see, I'm establishing the rule and then I'm saying except for SUVs and minivans, where the percentage of diesel fuel cars was greater than electric cars. Do you see what I just did there? I tried to come up with a rule and immediately presented the exception coming after. But trust me, a lot of the time on the exam, they will put these obvious patterns in the data for you to identify. So it's not like the real world where you have, like lots of complex random numbers. There will usually be a pattern, and the examiners will try to make this pattern as observable and as easily identifiable as possible for you. So there's no need to really worry, am I going to be able to find a pattern or not? Even in this example that really doesn't have a lot of patterns in it, I showed you how you could describe a general pattern even though you're mentioning the exceptions within it. Okay, so what is the final key takeaway or vital piece of information that we can extract from this chart? Again, that's easy. Take a close look and you can see that certain categories on the whole tend to have larger numbers in general. This is another way of looking at that rule that I was telling you about. So let's see. For example, if you look closely, you'll see that the percentage of electric, gas, and diesel vehicles was greatest in the sedan category. That is, more people in this European country tended to own a sedan vehicle regardless of whether it was electric, gas, or diesel. In fact, there is an exception, and that is diesel, right? So there were more people owning diesel SUVs, diesel fueled SUVs compared to diesel fuel sedans. So again, you could mention a general rule if there are no exceptions. So if we didn't have the diesel situation here, we could have said that the highest percentage of people in this European country owned a sedan. All right, that would have been true. But because we have this exception, we're going to have to put it this way. The highest percentage of people in this European country owned sedans, regardless of fuel category, except for diesel cars, which were more common among SUV owners. So you see, the rule is established and the exception is presented and next to it. But then if you want to go with an absolute rule, it's vans, right? So consistently, regardless of the type of fuel source, vans had the lowest percentage of owners, right? So here we could put it this way. We could say that among all these vehicle types, the smallest percentage of ownership belonged to vans, where the least amount of electric, gas, and diesel vehicles were owned, right? Okay, well, this brings this episode to a close. I deliberately extended the duration of this particular lesson because understanding and planning your response is very important, more important than you would imagine. And there are just so many things that could go wrong if you fail to pay close attention to these features and these details of your response. What I want you to do is review examples from the course book, from the IELTS preparation material that you have available to you, and then try to answer all of these questions that we've prepared for each case. So take a Cambridge IELTS book, open it up to Writing Task 1 Academic, take a look at the chart. First, go through the understanding process. Make sure you can identify the noun phrase. Make sure you pay attention to all the features, and then make sure you're able to describe one random part of the chart for yourself. Having done that, I want you to proceed with planning. Ask yourself, how can I divide the data into 2 or 3 parts? How can I summarize each part into 2 or 3 sentences? And then finally, how can I identify 2 pieces of vital information? In the next lesson, we're going to proceed to structuring our response, developing the paragraphs, and later we'll learn about the language structures that you could use to put your writing into well-formed grammatical sentences. Thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. If you did, please share, like, and subscribe, and let your friends know about this video lecture series. Remember, by becoming a member of this channel, you can have access to additional content and complete video tutorials. I'll see you all in the next lesson.